Well, here we are at our next episode. Welcome, Renee.
Hey, welcome to you too. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to be here again. And, it's been a long, cold winter. Do I say that a lot?
Yeah,
Because
it's a theme.
it is a theme. But, the good thing about winter and being a farmer is this is the season of free lunches, right? There's always all kinds of meetings, so we get to go and be with other farmers, and get free lunches, free barbecues, listen to the markets, listen to all the reports coming for the next growing season. What are you going to do? So there's an upside, I guess.
Yeah, who turns down a free lunch? My side, the legislature's in full swing across the street from my office, so I too can head over for lunches and gatherings if I choose.
See?
And February, they're right in the thick of it. So there's going to be their first funnel coming up here soon, and they're gonna that kind of winnows down what kind of grand ideas they have to move forward this session, and everybody's excited for that. So tis the season for all things legislative on my side of the world. Well, today we're going to be talking about we call some missing links, some things that we're seeing and noticing as we're working in the community with different providers and systems that seem to be missing across all kinds of categories. And we're going to do three different things. And this is going to be a three-part series. So today we're going to talk about the kind of the beginning of it and then dive into one and then go into the others. But the three missing links that I see most often, Jason, are lack of communication, collaboration, and cooperation. So I know when you're out working, we always talk about this, but the lack of communication in a system really becomes one of the biggest problems we see. And that seems like it's so basic, but when you bring it up, it is always a shock and an amazement how few people we work with have been in the same room together. So talk to us, Jason, about communication. What do you see when we're out and about?
It's just an understatement. And as I think about communication, I think of never assume all the parties involved in a system or even in a family are communicating with each other. And it really doesn't matter what level we want to approach this on, whether it's family communication, work communication amongst coworkers and supervisors, or if we're talking about systems communicating with each other. We just can't assume, I get to talk about communication a lot in businesses and family owned businesses because that's what we have in the agricultural sector. And it's so oftentimes with these $1 million companies, right? And nobody in the family's talked about what's going to happen next. What are we going to do to transition this family? And really that just outlines, across the board as I think about how do we get people to talk, Renee? And what is it that we can do to have those difficult conversations?
Yeah. And what's interesting about that too, it's not always just difficult conversations that aren't being had. It can be some of the real basic ones. And it's sad, but one of the things that you and I do a lot with any kind of group we work with is bringing the right partners together in a stakeholder meeting. And I find it fascinating every time people that we can clearly see need to work together, collaborate together. They don't even talk or even know each other. And that is so scary because people get so stuck in their own bubble that they don't look beyond what they're doing. And I get it's been busy. I get that since COVID, that's now 4 years ago. But since then, times have changed, but people got so insular and so looking inside that I think we just sort of missed the fact that, hey, we're not self made people. There's almost no one that can do everything for themselves by themselves with no support. Yet the world has sort of shifted into that matter that we don't think we have to have relationships, and communication is the first piece to go. We just don't see people talking, and that's just crazy. So today we're going to focus on some ways to improve communication within our organizations and talk through some real life examples where communication was the reason that the system didn't work. And we've had these things just over and over again. But Jason, have you ever had an issue with anybody that you can think of kind of top of mind where you just figured out kind of quick that it was just about miscommunication? It wasn't really an issue. It was just like you weren't even on the same page to start with when you had a conversation. You ever have those?
I think every day. Which as you say that, I think about all these situations where no one knows how to take the first step. And I liked what you just said, about sometimes we get stuck and we don't even know we're not communicating
Mm.
with the right people. And then sometimes we do know we're not communicating, but then we don't know what to do about it. I think about a recent conversation of, I'm often in the egg world talking to families and, about what they're doing, succession planning. And I had a daughter call me and she said, Dad's still not talking to us about what he's going to do. he's 85 and he's still farming everything on his own, and we want to help. And I said, well, have you talked about it? And guess what? The answer was, no, we can't talk about that. And I'm like, well, we can't do anything until we're all willing to have a conversation together. And I think so oftentimes the answers that we have on the outside, it seems so clear. But when you're in the middle of it all, whether you're an executive or whether you're a legislator or whether you're that family member, it's really hard to see a path forward.
Right. And I know in organizations and in governments, you sometimes think the person that's making the decision, the rule, the whatever has dictated it so that everybody knows. But I'm telling you, having been a legislator, the intent of what the legislature meant and then what turns out at the end may be very different if it wasn't communicated well. And so then how it's implemented or what it looks like at the end, and you're like, how in the world did we get there? Just the communication around it didn't really cascade through, as we talk about cascading communication. Same things happen in organizations. You know, we've talked to people, we brought them into a room, and the CEOs and all the big dogs in the room are like, oh yeah, we all have great relationships, we get along well. But when you start looking into the next level down, the management or just the frontline staff or even the night shift, you're like, they don't get along at all. And nobody at the top knows that. And so there's this lack of communication, even if you think you've said it. And I think there's like one of those statements out there that you kind of have to talk about something until you're just so sick of talking about it. And by the time you're sick of it, other people are finally starting to catch on. And I know when you and I worked with COVID Recovery Iowa and then Project Recovery Iowa, we felt like we were doing the very same presentation day in, day out, day in, day out. And you and I were just sick of it. But how many times we'd say it and then it was brand new, like we'd never said it before. And so communication really takes that repetition, and we don't always talk about that.
When I think that's hard, especially in organizations, to have the same conversation over and over again. You know, I think I find myself, there's still a certain data point I still use in presentations today, 4 years after we first started talking about, and it's the anxiety and depression piece of the data we still follow, Renee. And there's times that I'm out and I'm talking about that. I'm like, I don't want to talk about this data again. And I do it. And 5 people come up to me after the presentation and say, I had no idea there was data about that. That totally validates how I'm feeling, how my team's feeling, how my family is feeling. And so I'm constantly reminded that it is about being repetitive. It's about sharing that same information over and over and over again, because that's the only way you can ensure that it's actually cascaded through your organization. But what makes it hard is so oftentimes it's in a newsletter once, or you say it at an annual meeting, and then you're like, well, I already told everyone about that. I don't need to share that again. Guess what? Nobody knows about it. And then you ask yourself 6 months later, well, I thought everyone knew that.
Right.
Well,
yeah. You think about people with their missions and their values and thinking about that in organizations, and every piece of research will show you that, talking about you need to start every meeting with the mission, every meeting with your values, and remind people this is what we're doing and why we're doing it. Because people very quickly fall off on a lot of the complaining and the grumbling and not understanding their purpose in life at their work. And if it goes to, they don't see how their piece ties into the big picture. So if we're not always telling them the big picture and giving them something to anchor to, it's really easy to get off track. And even though you feel like you're saying it over and over and over, I know for myself in the office, we have 3 main goals that we're working toward. And I have a big whiteboard, and I just put it straight on the whiteboard. And then I have a tally week in, week out, because we actually have data we can collect, kind of some KPIs, some key performance indicators for those that don't know, of what they were shooting for. And so I gather the data, but I have it posted on the wall. So when everybody comes in, I make reference to it about, see where we're going on our goals, see the progress that we've made, or here's where we could still improve, because it helps me keep it front of mind. Because again, saying it once, we all forget that we've talked about it at all. And it's just a lot. So Jason, there's some data about how we could do better at this in workplaces, and they apply to not just workplaces, but like you said, family and everywhere. So what are some of those things you see out there in the research?
well, there's tons of research, and we can't talk about communication and not have us go back to some of those early studies of just basic interpersonal communication, right? And so when I think about how do we communicate at the most basic level, we communicate best in person, and so as we've looked at the last 4 years of how we've moved to Zoom, or haven't moved where we've just shut off the camera when we have meetings. And so this is, we're in the middle of February and, we have blizzards and things here in Iowa. And so I've just been through a couple of weeks where I've had a ton of Zoom meetings and my whole family's been at home and they also have Zoom meetings, and how oftentimes the camera's off. And guess what? We don't communicate our best when we can't see the people in front of us. Even thinking about podcasts and radio, right? 7% of our communication, going back to those original Moravian studies, are the words that we use. It's all about the nonverbals and all those other things that you see, that you take in with your senses, that are really what's important with that. And so, we can look back at some of that original data from the 70s, right? And that has a lot of application today, when there's so much opportunity to misconstrue information. Simply reading something isn't the same as how it's conveyed by another human being. As we start thinking about artificial intelligence, all those things, what happens to our ability to communicate and communicate accurately?
Right. Yeah. In my job, we do a lot of decision making about releasing people. And to do that, you have a lot of things on paper. But one of my favorite parts is when we get to actually interview the person. And that's to your point, because you can only get so much information, written or maybe via email or even a verbal conversation. But it's in the interview that you can really see if somebody's serious about what you're talking about, if they really mean what they're saying. There's all those nonverbals. Sometimes you get somebody who's telling you the right words, but you can tell they're visibly hostile. And so it's not matching up. Or they're trying to tell you that they're being honest about something, but they just have that look. It doesn't line up. And so it's really, really important, like you're saying, is getting that visual and that confirmation, and how you come across to people. They make those decisions often very early. I joke about this at the office, but I always had a reputation for one that would get into fights. I apparently look like I get into fights. I've never had to fight a day in my life, but it's a reputation. And so I apparently come off as if I'm going to beat the crap out of somebody. And to be fair, I would keep myself healthy. So if I ever had to, I'd figure something out, but I would never want to be in a fight. And so it was just kind of funny because you can build reputations on what people see. And so that's where this communication thing comes from, right? So if you're not talking to somebody and you've assumed whatever about them, you're not going to get along, you don't like them, they'd never like you, whatever, but you actually haven't communicated, you're leaving a whole lot on the table because you just have made assumptions based on what you see, and you have no idea what the person may be really all about. And that happens all the time.
So when we think about steps to better communicate, Renee, being clear and concise, preparing ahead of time. I know a lot of times when I need to convey something, it really helps me to write it out, because sometimes, guess what? I can kind of get off topic when I'm in the middle of conveying a message. And so sometimes some of us have to actually prepare ahead of time of what is it that we're going to communicate, and how do we make sure we're communicating it with the audience that we're intending to communicate it with? Because the way I convey messages is going to vary depending on the audience that I'm conveying it to. What do you think about that?
Yeah, we had a case recently that could have been in the media, and you're going to have, the media is listening and paying attention to, so you might be quoted. So beforehand, we have a team meeting to say, look, this is not the day to not be prepared. This is not the day to say stray questions or stray thoughts out your mouth that you haven't thought through, because if media is listening, and media can always be listening, I have public hearings, so that's a thing. But sometimes you have an inkling that there might be more media on certain days. So you've got to be thoughtful about, hey, how do you really want to come across? And do you really want to say certain things? And if you're taken out of context, are you going to be okay with what the media made of it? And that's a whole nother level of conversations. But if we're not thoughtful and we use too many words can really get us in trouble pretty quick, one way or the other. So Jason, I know as we've done a lot of work, we've been in some situations where you could just tell communication was the biggest problem, like instantly, even though it was really not obvious to the people. But can you share a couple of those? I know there's one with the sheriff and the emergency department that's one of your favorites.
Absolutely. I think about a time we were working in a community, and literally the sheriff's department stopped talking to the emergency room of the hospital in town, even though they had to work together, on pretty much a daily basis, because late at night when stuff's going on, a lot of times those are the two places open, and that's where issues happen, right? The sheriff's department often have to investigate follow
Mhm.
up on things, and not even talking about all the mental health issues that they have to collaborate on to sort out, find cooperation and
Right.
communicate around. And so, as we think about this series, as we go through this, of thinking about how could that how could that relationship come to a place where there's no communication at all, that they're just purposefully ignoring each other, and then thinking that in some ways both of them can continue to do their jobs and fulfill the need in the community.
Right. And I think, isn't that the one where they ended up not speaking so much that like attorneys showed up to speak on behalf of the other party, like in the
They,
emergency? They
yeah, they
couldn't
got
even
to
talk throughout without an attorney in a hospital where they absolutely should have been collaborating. And it ended up with attorneys standing in the emergency department arguing about whatever because they couldn't speak at all around attorneys. That's just mind-boggling, but it's not one incident. You can read about these in the paper. You can look them up. It's crazy. I know another situation that actually turned out to be a good situation, but we know another region that we do work in, their biggest partner, their hospital, with older, or I guess wouldn't say older, but previous leadership didn't communicate with people. So when we brought them together in that region, people just assumed they wouldn't be cooperative and they just had not talked. There was a major leadership shift and the incoming people had a very different mindset and wanted to be in communication, wanted to collaborate, wanted to cooperate. But it actually took us putting them in a room for them to figure out that, hey, we should talk and we should work together. And it turned out great. But it's funny to me that it took, consultants helping bring the people together that naturally could have been doing that all on their own. They didn't really need us to do a whole lot because once we made the connection and they're like, oh, this is great. Then they off and running on, their contracts and all the different things that needed to be happening. But it was just because, again, something had happened in the past. Somebody was harmed or hurt from something that happened years ago, and you just didn't talk about it. It just sort of stopped all communication, and they just assumed that group was not cooperative and was not part of the bigger picture, and we just don't have to work with them when they were the largest provider in the area. That is crazy to me, but we did it. And
Yeah,
Jason, bed tracking systems. You love this topic. Talk about communication and bed tracking. How much do you love that?
I do love a good bed tracking
You do.
system.
You do.
Yet I've yet to see a good bed tracking system, so I'm
Never
not
met
sure how
one.
I can say that. You know, I'm actually struggling with this right now, because I'm working in a state around a bed tracking system and the data that it's supposed to be sharing us. And so when we think
Hmm.
about bed tracking, right, rarely
Hmm.
does it track in real time. So it's based upon when data is updated. Is there a time of day? Is anyone held accountable to actually use it?
Hmm.
Or is it just representing 60% of all the beds? Which then
Yep.
again makes it useless. And so, more often than not, we find really critical flaws in how some of these systems are set up, in the data that
Yep.
they're reporting. And actually, I've been watching a certain bed tracking system in real time, supposedly in a local state, and it swung from no waiting list to 132 people on a waiting list in 5 days. I'm guessing
Wow.
there was a data collection issue somewhere or a data reporting issue on the website.
Wow.
But I've
All
yet to
right.
follow up with the appropriate Health and Human Services department to figure out if I can find the real data.
Whoa.
Um,
That's
but I think that's part of our skepticism, and I don't want to be too cynical, but I'm always skeptical sometimes, that I think those are great things, but are they communicating what they should be communicating? Right.
well,
And oftentimes there's other issues that flaw the data.
yeah. You don't want to be cynical, but I'm gonna be. Because here's the deal. A lot of times when those things were created, the right communication didn't happen from the beginning. So you've got a tool or something that you didn't even talk to the right people about in the first place, or you didn't agree with them when they told you it wasn't going to work because of how you were thinking about it. And so instead of listening and having to dig in and be like, okay, what are the challenges here so we could actually build something that might work, we just go ahead with our plan because man, we're going to track beds, period. And then you get to hear, and now you have to have candid communication about what didn't work when those people were like, I could have told you this if you'd have just listened in the first place, right? So sometimes by the time you get to like a policy or a law or whatever, if you didn't listen to your constituents before, you're creating a mess. And we see this, unfortunately, all the time in government where the rubber meets the road and it didn't work at all. And those people were like, we tried to tell you. So that's the hard part, is they were trying to communicate, but people that were making decisions didn't always listen. And people get so frustrated in that. And then this bed tracking system space, I can guarantee in the case that you're talking about with this current group, right? It's legislators who thought they fixed it. They created a system. It should be fixed. And here they are, however long they're into it. And they're like, this isn't fixed. We don't have the beds. I can't imagine what happened. Well, I can tell you what happened. A few places, communication did not occur that needed to, or if it was given, it wasn't heeded. And I don't know if you found that to be true yet, but I'm certain if you continue down your path of bed tracking, where sticking points on communication happen are probably in multi phases. It's probably not just one time we didn't communicate. That's my guess. Maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
Absolutely. And you kind of raise a really good point, right? We should never assume that communication happened. And so we see this a lot between legislators
Mhm.
and then the systems that they design the legislation around, right? And so we see this between legislators and state departments of, we work a lot in the health and human services space
Mhm.
in some of the states. And so oftentimes we get called, and several times we've been called directly by legislators or
Mhm.
legislative subcommittees who say, hey, we passed this law 2 years ago. And those people over at DHS just aren't doing anything. We want you to go tell us why. And so then we have to go over and have a conversation. And we realize it's just because they've never talked. Like,
Oh,
we're this
sure.
intermediary, and we're like, well, can we just all have a conversation together? Because, that's really how we start to solve problems, is
Right.
when we all sit at a table and communicate it. And I think that so oftentimes there's not that strategy in place in order for the right people to sit down at the table and listen, right? Part of communication is listening. And I think you hit it on the head when you were just talking about it. We really struggle to listen. And so that's really a skill, I think, in general, we're losing. And so part of the process that we need to reteach folks is, how do we listen and truly hear what someone's telling us so that we can create something better down the road. And sometimes we're going to hear stuff we don't want to hear, like
Mm.
maybe our original ideas really weren't very good. And so that's kind of hard sometimes. But, I've learned a couple of times over some projects that every now and then I can be wrong, Renee. And
Oh,
my ideas and perceptions can be incorrect. And so it's really important we hear that. But that's tough.
yeah. We have some legislation going through the state right now that I'm reading it and I want to know what the intent is, because I can see, depending upon the intent, it probably doesn't do anything that they think it does. And so I'm at this juncture. I'm like, do I want to help them understand what it will actually do? Or would I like to just watch it crash and burn and maybe it doesn't end up in law? And you got to make a decision. But it's funny because they didn't talk to, well, us or anybody that's in our field that does anything with this. And so the idea came completely, you can tell, just an outside party without talking to the people it impacts. And so I kind of want to sit down with them and be like, okay, what were you trying to do? If you can tell me what you're trying to do, maybe I can help you get there. But what you're trying to say here, this isn't going to get you what you think it does. And that's sort of the side I'm leaning on today. So I guess I'm going to go in and listen and see after I listen. I mean, maybe they've intended exactly what it says, and then it's not going to work. And if that's what they intended and that's what they want, and it's not going to, fine. But I mean, I'm going to try to go in and listen and say, hey, I'm happy to try to help in this. But I know, Jason, you've had that happen too, where you're stuck in this bed tracking thing and you've tried to give people feedback. And the funny part is, you can tell in other states it doesn't work. So when another state decides to do it too, it hasn't worked anywhere, to your point when you started at the beginning of the conversation. So you're now working in a state where it's never worked in any state. And how are you going to communicate that to the people you're working with? Because that's not going to be a message they necessarily want to hear.
Well, and I think sometimes the message that's heard is you just don't want to change, and I don't think it's about not changing or adapting. We all know we have to change and do things differently as we move forward, because everything we do, right, it's become more complicated. We're going to have to change as technology changes. We're going to have to adapt as we understand what people need, and how we can provide better care. I think we can't get confused with, we're stuck where we're at and we don't want to change, with, we can do this in a positive way, but we have to bring everyone along. And I think that's the challenge that we face today, especially when some of these issues are so divisive. It's like it's not a black or white issue. It's simply an issue of, we've got to all come along and find a path forward. And I think that's part of our challenge as we think about communicating and listening and hearing, is that we have to figure out in some of these situations of how do we move forward with a system that's going to work, right? Do we need to track beds? Absolutely. But we have to figure out how we can track beds that's going to meet everyone's needs and be accurate and measure what it is that we sent out to measure in the first place.
Right. Good point. Well, today, my self-care policy of the week, we're in February. And by now, you might have thought of some things that you wanted to change in your routine in January. And you're like, hey, I'm going to do these things. Maybe it's a morning routine or an evening routine, some things that you might want to do. Well, getting into about, 5 or 6 weeks into the year, if you're a goal setter on a quarterly basis, now's the time you should actually do kind of an after action review to see how this is going. If you haven't reviewed it or even thought about it, is it going the way you wanted it to? And this is true not just for self-care. This is a process that needs to happen for any kind of project you're working in, any kind of system that you've designed. At some point, you've got to go do the research to see if it's actually doing what you thought it was going to do. And there's a really quick and easy way to do that. It's called an after action review, and there's only 4 points. The 4 points are what is working and what isn't. Those are pretty simple. And then what do you want to continue and what needs to change? And so as we're talking about things today, this applies to self-care, but it can also apply to the bed tracking system, right? So it's a tool that if you know how to use an after action review, you can decide, is my self-care plan working? The routine that I wanted, is it getting me the desired outcomes I was looking for? And if it's not, it might be time to change something. What's working, what's not? And those are really basic questions, but I don't think we take enough time to sit back and say, okay, what is happening? Is it doing well? And is it not? And the things that are doing well, you need to celebrate that and continue and really double down and dive in. So when you're working in systems, when you're working out with people, whatever those things are that are working, that's your strengths. And that's where you start going and continue to work in that space. And so it's just a really easy idea as you're thinking about, if I'm taking care of myself better this year, parts may be working, parts are not, but we'll just kind of do a little review and then you can tweak some strategies. Now that you're about halfway into this new quarter, it's a good time to tweak the strategies to see if you can still hit those goals that you set. So today we talked a whole lot about communication, and this is the first of a 3-part series. We're calling it Missing Links, and we're talking about how we miss links that are about communication, collaboration, and cooperation. Well, today we really did a deep dive on communication and about the fact that nonverbal communication is super important, but also there's tips that you can follow if you want to make your communication better. And then all sorts of examples of ways where problems occurred simply because people didn't communicate. And sometimes we think that's way too simple, but that really is the best place to start. If you're having a problem out there at work, in life, or in a system, start with communication. It will get you a long way. Next week, we'll be back and we'll be talking about collaboration. We'll see you all then.